Hi, this is Molly Stevens, one of the hosts of Everything Cookbooks. Today's episode is one of a 6-part series during which we are re-releasing some of our favorite past conversations on the topic of voice. In this episode, Andrea and I are talking with Kenji López-Alt, best-selling author and chief culinary advisor for Serious Eats. We talk to Kenji about creating and maintaining a voice of authority. We also get into how he started out and how he interacts with his fans and, of course, his impressive cookbooks. We hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll be back in the fall with a whole new lineup of host chats and guest interviews. Thanks for listening. When you think of authority figures, who do you think of? Teachers, parents, leaders, cops? But in the kitchen, our authority figures are more likely cooks and cookbook authors. But just how does someone become a cooking authority? Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Molly Stevens, and I'm here with one of my co-hosts, Andrea Nguyen. Hey, Andrea.
Hey, Molly. How are ya?
Good today. So, Andrea, I think it is fair to say that you're one of the leading authorities of Asian American cooking and foodways. And I suppose I could say that I'm an authority on cooking techniques like braising, roasting. But, I mean, what does that even mean?
You know, Molly, that is a darn good question, and actually a hard one to answer. Because, you know, when I describe what I do, I say that I'm a cultural bridge builder and a leading voice on Asian food and cooking. But does that mean that I am an authority? You know, it does. Because I think of being an authority as meaning someone who is committed to having a point of view, having a certain deep knowledge on a topic, and sharing or promoting that knowledge and experience. When you think about it and look a little bit deeper, author and authority both come from the same root words that mean to invent or to promote.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. We talk a lot about the fun of making cookbooks on this podcast, or the potential fun, I should say. But when you're setting out to communicate a deep knowledge, authority on a topic or a field, it's a lot to manage. I mean, you can't just sit down and type up your experience and hope it sounds convincing. I mean, you have to craft this voice in such a way that communicates this knowledge, this experience, your deep research. And you need to write so your reader trusts that you do indeed know what you're talking about.
100%. There's also a certain amount of responsibility that comes along with that voice of authority. And once you get that voice of authority, and once you have it locked in, you also got to manage it. And how do you do that?
Well, to help us answer that, today we are talking to Kenji López-Alt, an author with enough authorship and authority that many fans simply refer to him as Kenji. Andrea and I are curious to talk about how he shapes and negotiates his voice of authority. Kenji, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We're pretty excited to have you on. Andrea and I have been doing as deep dive as we could into these books of yours to prepare for it. You know, when we write, and especially when we author whole books, we approach the process differently based on our own individual experience, our backgrounds, our goals, objectives, and things like that. And you bring this unmistakable voice of authority to your work, right?
I've been told that, I hear you.
And so we're just really sort of going back, what shaped this voice?
Well, you know, when I think of a voice of authority, I think, okay, so this person is telling me something and they have the evidence to back it up, the experience or the evidence, you know, whichever one it is. And so, you know, I think that's really what it is that when I write something in a book, I either try and back it up through, you know, by referencing other people's work or by experimentation. You know, I think it all goes back to sort of like the middle school idea, like the math class or science class idea of showing your work. It's one thing to have the right answer, but it's another one to show how you arrived at that answer. If you just give the right answer, you have to say to people, "Hey, just trust me. I know how this works. Just trust me." You know, and that's, I think, a harder pill to swallow than say, here, this is why it works because X, Y, and Z. These are things you might have wondered about, and I've tested those things, and here's what happened when I tested them. And so this is why I arrived at this answer. And also, these are the other potential answers I considered along my way, and these are the reasons why I believe that this is the right answer and not these other ones. Yeah, ultimately, authority just comes down to being able to show your work. In journalism or in science writing, you have to be able to either reference the original research or reference other writers who have done the research in order to sort of have any sort of leg of authority to stand on.
Right. When you were initially in college, you thought you were going to study biology, which,
Right.
that's very science oriented. And when you reference math, in middle school, I think to myself, well, we used to have to do those, proofs and like an algebra to work backwards.
Yeah.
There is that idea of proving your point. Any author, once that we write something and commit it to paper and to print, we become the voice of authority. And each of us has a different way of going at it and presenting ourselves. And as Molly said, yours is it's yours, right? Like when you read your stuff, you go, oh yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah, well, it's funny because, as you know, like current you is not the same as past you. Whenever you publish something, especially in like a fixed print medium, like a newspaper or a magazine or a book, it's not always going to be you. That's just you at that moment writing those words. And especially with a book that has such a long production schedule, a long turnaround time, it's like the words you write, they're not going to be out in the world for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, depending on how long editing and photography and all the designing and all that stuff takes. And so by the time a book actually comes out, you might be in a very different place. And I find that happens to me, that I go back and I read my first book, The Food Lab. That I started writing that book. It was published, I think, 8 years ago. But a lot of the work that was going into that was stuff I was doing when I was in my 20s. And it's like that's very different from where I am now at 43. But for better or worse, it is. It's out there and it is what it is, and you kind of have to either back it up or explain what might have changed in your opinion or your viewpoint since then.
What you just said earlier about showing your work, it just like a little light bulb went off for me about like how you would define your voice, the way you write, because there is so much. I had a note somewhere where I wrote belt and suspenders, where you're giving the information in as many different ways as you possibly can. There's just this comprehensive, this encyclopedic. And I'm just thinking about your science origins are really clear, but then also your work with American Test Kitchen to Serious Eats. Was that the evolution?
Yeah.
And how that may have shaped this voice, this sort of abundance of information, this generosity of information really is what it is.
Well, I'd say a lot of that comes from working at Serious Eats. I wrote a couple of articles for them in 2008, and then I came on full time as managing editor and then culinary director in 2009.
They were pretty scrappy then, right? It was still a pretty small.
Yeah, it was like 7 of us in a room. Yeah, we were. It was very my first freelance articles that I wrote for, like my very first Food Lab article. I wasn't even full time at Serious Eats. It was about boiled eggs, and that was a 3,000 word article that I think I got paid $30 for, which was $5 more than like the going rate for blog entries at that time. It's very different now. But yeah, it was definitely like sort of the early days of food blogs. But that's Serious Eats was where I really found my voice, because prior to that I was working in magazines, right? And I was at Cooks Illustrated for a few years. And Cooks Illustrated was great because they gave me the freedom and the budget to sort of test whatever I wanted, So if I had a question about cooking, they would encourage me to go out and test it. And so that was wonderful. That was because that was something that, working in restaurants, I'd always wanted to do that kind of stuff. But in a restaurant, you don't really have the time or the budget to do that. It's like you cook the chicken the way the chef tells you to cook it because it has to be the exact same chicken every time. And if you have a question about why you're cooking it that way, you don't really have the opportunity to say, well, I'm going to cook chicken 17 different ways today and see what's different. Because it doesn't matter what's different. What matters is what's the same, because that's what the customer expects. Whereas at Cooks Illustrated, you were encouraged to cook it 17 different ways. Or, I did like a pie crust recipe there where I did 130 something different pie crusts over the course of a couple months. And so that was great. The one sort of downside I found at Cooks Illustrated is that they had, especially then, I think it's changed a little bit now. Maybe it's changed a lot now, but especially back then, like there was a very, very distinct sort of Cooks Illustrated voice, right? And I always think of the Cooks Illustrated editorial process back then as like a sausage factory, where it's like you can take all these different ingredients and everybody could be a little bit different, but then it all gets kind of sort of ground up and turned into the same Cooks Illustrated sausage.
Well
was a
said.
good sausage, but it sort of stripped away personality from the voice. And so, when I started working at Serious Eats, that's where I feel like I really had the opportunity to just experiment with writing. It's blog format. So I was writing, every single day, and I was publishing articles, 3 to 4 times a week. And so that's a lot of practice. And I think, as with anything, like the more you practice writing, the better you get at it. And also sort of the more opportunity you have to find out what your voice is, which I think for any writer is the hardest thing. It's like figuring out what is unique to my voice and what am I doing that's not just like emulating other writers that I like. And especially on an online platform like Serious Eats, where there was a community that was very interactive. And so you can come up with an idea, test it over the course of a week, write about it, and then immediately you would have feedback from people who are either questioning the idea or who are going to then go home and try it out for themselves. And you can see, okay, like these are the things people are interested in. This is the part that works for me. These are the things that people found interesting in the writing. These are the types of recipes that people are looking for. And so it's a very, very small and fast feedback loop. Yeah, I feel like over the course of the 5 years or so I was at Serious Eats, I had a very sort of accelerated and sort of crash course in writing and how to write in a way that helps people understand relatively complicated scientific principles or processes. Not just helps people understand it, but also gets people excited and interested in those things. Yeah, and that's sort of all what led up to the first book.
You had like a particular format to your articles at Serious Eats. I can like see the outline, like why this works, and then you also practiced photography, and your audience grew. You had like this megaphone voice of Kenji, and it was really cool to witness and participate in that, to tell you the truth, because it was very exciting to see you craft that voice of authority. We think of authority as like a negative thing. Sometimes it's like cops or parents, and now you're a parent, so you are the voice of authority to your 2 kids. But I think that authority comes with a lot of different parameters that authors, we get to shape. And so one of the cool things that is in your writing process and evolution in terms of being a book author is that in the Food Lab, you're a generalist, because you covered a lot of different topics.
Right.
And then now with The Walk, it's a single subject, culturally loaded cooking method and tool. Right. So in the evolution of your work and being as a writer, how is that transition of like going, the big funnel down to this very, very deep dive into a single subject?
Well, the first book, as you said, it's sort of a general book, but it does sort of focus on, particularly on American and American adjacent things that the audience would be familiar with. And the first book, I really thought of it less as a cookbook, less as like a recipe book and more as a food science book. And the idea was that like, all right, here's this recipe for chili that is 4 pages long and has 47 ingredients and takes like 3 days to make. And a recipe like that, it's like some people might make it, but I haven't made that recipe since I wrote it in the book, it's not a very practical recipe and not one that I expected a ton of people to actually follow to the letter. But the idea was that like, by taking a dish that a lot of people are familiar with, at least a lot of people in this audience are familiar with, macaroni and cheese or chili or meatloaf or hamburgers or whatever, that I always consider the dish sort of like the hook that gets people interested in the more technical aspects of cooking, right? And so like by reading this chili recipe, you learn about some of the principles of braising, right? You learn about how meat reacts when you brown it versus not browning it. You learn about how beans react when they're salted versus not salted, or soaked versus not soaked. And so you learn all these little things that ideally you apply to cooking outside of this one particular recipe. And so, so that first book, it's like, a lot of people thought it was like the recipes are kind of overwrought and, and too difficult and too involved. And I agree. I think they are. But that's because I really was thinking of the recipes more as a way to illustrate cooking techniques as opposed to being actual like everyday recipes. With a book like The Walk, on the other hand, the Walk, that book, there is a lot of technical stuff in it, but the idea was like, all right, here's this tool that I've been using for ever since I started cooking. And it's like by far the one that I use most in the kitchen. And, now, especially as, it's like when I wrote the Food Lab, I was like, I was married, but we didn't have kids. And my wife and I were both very sort of career focused, and I was spending all my time cooking and doing all this stuff. And it's like, now, all right, I've got 2 kids. I spend an awful lot of time just like trying to get dinner on the table for my family. And I understood, there were people looking for that, especially like at a magazine like Cooks Illustrated. That's like a lot of what we focus on is like writing recipes for people who just want the practical get dinner on the table thing. But with the wok, that was really the whole goal. It's like, this is the tool that I've used the most in my life. This is the tool I used like when I was single and living with roommates, when I was in college, when I was married without kids, and now like when I'm married with kids. And I found this tool to be versatile and useful in every one of those life situations. And these are the ways in which it's useful. And these are a lot of the recipes that I've enjoyed cooking with it. So with the wok, it was really much more, the book was trying to really demonstrate the practicality of this one tool, especially because it's like inexpensive and versatile too, right? It's like in the wok, there's a few hundred recipes. And of those, I think only 2 of them require anything other than just this one pan plus a burner, right? And it can be like a portable burner. It doesn't, whatever it is. You could go camping with a wok and a portable burner and cook virtually every recipe in that book, which I find to be extremely, useful and practical for myself and hopefully for readers as well.
So when I write recipes that are wok related, I feel the strange pressure on me because people who come to my work expect like this sort of cultural authenticity, and they associate the wok with like, oh, Chinese cooking,
right?
And so hearing you talk about the wok and the way that you do in terms of its practicality and portability, and no matter how much that I like say to people, you can deep fry in a wok and you can save oil and it's going to heat up faster. You control the temperature. I can go on and on and on about the beauty of the wok. But they, at the end of the day, they expect that there's certain cultural information from me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always feeling like I'm kind of an imposter because, my people, like Vietnamese people, we sometimes use a wok, but a lot of people use skillets, and it's like this sort of in between thing. But yet I love using a wok. How do you deal with that cultural baggage that a tool like the wok has?
Absolutely. Well, the first thing is that I try and recognize that I'm not a cultural authority on the wok. And, and I think as a writer, you have to come from a place of honesty, right? It's like, so that was definitely something I struggled with as far as how I was going to present this work. It's like, am I even allowed to be writing about this? Like, it's like, what can I offer that like Grace Young hasn't already done? Ultimately, what it is that I grew up in big American cities like New York and Boston. And I grew up going to Chinatowns and eating in Chinatowns. It's like my dad is a white guy from Western Pennsylvania, but he got really, he fell in love with Chinese food and particularly Chinese American food. And so I grew up being dragged around all the restaurants in Chinatown with my dad. And so that's sort of where I'm trying to come from with that book. It's like, I'm not Chinese. I'm not even Chinese American. I am Asian American. I'm Japanese American, but my experience with wok cooking comes from eating in these types of restaurants. My mom had to walk and cook Japanese dishes at home, and there are Japanese recipes in this book as well. But a lot of it is really just saying, hey, when I started cooking in college, like that's when I realized like how useful this wok is, and a lot of it, of course, also, when you have a tool like the wok that has this sort of cultural identity to it, you have to do a lot of referencing and a lot more than I did in like the food lab, right? It's like the food lab. Okay, I can write about macaroni and cheese, and I don't really have to talk too much about the history of macaroni and cheese or what it means to people, because people, at least in my audience, are familiar with the dish, right? Whereas in a book like the wok, I spent a lot more time in the book, and especially in the research for the book, interviewing people, reading, referencing other cookbooks and talking much more about sort of the history of certain dishes and the history of cooking techniques. But always sort of with the idea that I'm not trying to be the cultural authority on the wok. And if you want that kind of information, here are a bunch of other writers you can read who will be able to give you that information. All I'm trying to do is this narrow thing where it's like, I found the tool useful in this way, and I still find it useful in these ways. And I want, it's such a practical tool that I want it to be practical for you as well. I think a lot of it just comes down to not misrepresenting who you are and what you're trying to do with it, while also acknowledging people who do have sort of a deeper connection to the tool or the culture than you do.
It's so interesting what Andrew was saying about this funnel of going from, so the Food Lab was also the name of your column at Serious
Right.
Eats, right? So it's sort of this generalist thing to this very specific utensil, piece of equipment, technique, but you bring with it that voice that you developed at the Food Lab, where it's this conversational, and I mean, so much so that you're often anticipating readers' questions, or, and you do a Q&A kind of format, and you're often talking, you kind of, I don't know if there's a fourth wall in writing, but you're often breaking through and speaking directly to the reader in a very, like, as if you're sitting right there and saying, you're trying, you even said this earlier in this conversation about how you're trying to answer questions before they're being asked. And so it makes me wonder how you think about your reader. Are you like the coach, a teacher? Are you buddies? What it's you, because you really I feel like you have this relationship.
The person I always think of when I think about like what the voice I try to capture in my writing is Don Herbert, who was Mr. Wizard, who had his science show for kids. He was Bill Nye for the older generation. But I grew up waking up at 6 a.m. every day and watching Mr. Wizard's World on Nickelodeon. And he had this style where it was always him, and then he would have a kid on the show with him, and they would do an experiment together. But he always had this style of like, hey, like, here's this like really cool thing I want to show you, right? And it was never like a sort of professorial, lecture tone. It was much more of like let the kid do the thing, guide them gently, and then give them an explanation, or also ask them, what they think the explanations are. And it's sort of the approach I try and take with my own kids now, but also with my writing, where instead of thinking of myself as like sort of teaching a class, I just think of I try and think of myself as like, all right, if I had a really good friend who was in the kitchen with me and we were cooking together, but they had never seen this dish before, how would I talk to them, and like how would I express my excitement to them? Yeah, so that's sort of the voice I always go for, is like, here's this cool thing I learned. Let me show you because I think it's really cool. What do you think about it? And as far as like trying to anticipate reader questions, that comes from, like working at Cooks Illustrated, that magazine, part of the process for the recipe development process was you'd test the recipe, you'd come up with a potential final recipe, then you'd send it out to people, right? And then you'd send it out to 1,000 people, and maybe 200 of them would make it and then give you feedback on it. And so you go through this process where you basically do get all the questions that people are going to ask. And so by doing that repeatedly with a recipe every 1 or 2 recipes a month for several years, I think I gained a very good understanding of the types of difficulties that home cooks are going to have, which was very useful to me because before that I had come from a restaurant background. And I think, as both of you probably know, I think restaurant chefs are very bad recipe writers because they're used to working in restaurants where you have a very different set of equipment and parameters and goals than a home cook does. Moving from restaurants to Cooks Illustrated, I had to really learn how to put myself in the position of a home cook, especially as someone like who didn't grow up. I didn't grow up cooking. I learned to cook before I learned to really enjoy food. Even, like my first restaurant job, I did it because I kind of accidentally got a restaurant job for the summer because I was trying to get a job as a server just to make some extra money. And I ended up walking into a place that said they needed a prep cook. And so I was like, all right, I'll do that for the summer. That'll be fun. And I wasn't really into food at the time. And so I started cooking, and I realized, oh, this is like a really interesting thing. And once I started learning how to love to cook, then I started getting into really learning how to love food. And so I came at it as this sort of like I think the reverse way of most people come, where they love food and then they want to learn how to cook it. I had never really been in the position of a home cook. The only cooking I'd ever done was professionally. And so being thrown into it at Cooks Illustrated and discovering like, this is the way home cooks think, and these are the problems they have. And these are the limitations. These are what they need to do. That really taught me a lot. And then going from there to Serious Eats, where, again, with the sort of internet format, you get this really great feedback all the time about what recipes are useful, what recipes are not, what parts people have trouble with. So learning those types of things helps you identify what kind of problems people are going to have before they actually have them, so that you can guide them and make sure that they don't run into those problems.
And bringing your science background, where you're just the opportunity to test something and, test side by side and do all that was, because not every cook has that, I don't think. I know, some cooks are like, oh, this is just the way it's done.
Right.
And you brought to this like, well, what if we did it this way? Like, your natural curiosity, the whole, I remember when you did the egg thing with the green food coloring, because everyone says that farm fresh eggs are better because the brighter color, and, just deep curiosity that carries through is a real through line.
But like you guys, like all three of us are super curious people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know like all three of us can go down that rabbit hole on like all kinds of things, it's simple, like how to boil eggs, how to steam eggs, and so I'm always like trying to figure out and asking other people, okay, you go down that rabbit hole, you dig up your gems, and then you want to write every single bit of detail that you found, right?
Right.
Then there's a certain point where you're like, I got to curb my enthusiasm or else readers' eyes are going to glaze over and all that. So Kenji, what do you do to curb your enthusiasm? Because like you get to go long in your writing, right?
Yeah. Part of it is like working with good editors, so first of all, like working at Serious Eats, I didn't have to curb that enthusiasm, right? There was like an endless, the fire hose of articles that come out, that's what we called it when we were in blog form. It's just like a fire hose. There's just constant new stuff coming out. You get to experiment with writing. And so it's like, if you think about writing for a magazine or a newspaper, the difference there between writing online is that at a magazine and a newspaper, you have a subscriber base. Mm-hmm. They get the issue whether they want it or not, right? And so it's your job to make sure that what's in that issue is something that is targeted at your subscriber base, and so like at Cooks Illustrated with a recipe, for example, unless 80% of the people who you sent out the sample recipe to said they would make it again, it would not make it into the magazine. So only a select number of articles would make it into the recipes would make it into the magazine because we knew that that particular audience would be happy with it. Whereas online, it's much more that rather than you writing for an audience, it's that an audience will find you, right? And so it's like if you write an article about one specific subject, like people are not necessarily loyal to their one specific site. They check a bunch of different sites, or they get shared a bunch of different articles from across a bunch of different sites. And so you can write about whatever you want, and as long as you write it in a compelling way, I feel like you're going to find an audience for it, and the audience for 3,000 words on a boiled egg might be different from the audience for how to get wok hei flavor, right? And maybe there's overlap, but it'll be a different audience. But that doesn't mean that you can't write both of them and find an audience for each of them. So, and then a book again is sort of, you do have to limit yourself to a single subject, or at least a single organizing quality. You have to have a theme to the book, but you're not writing it for a subscriber of books. You're writing it for whoever wants to buy that particular book. And I feel like I've been very lucky in that the type of writing that I do and the type of voice that I have happens to be appealing to a lot of people. So it is something that I've been able to make a career out of, which I don't think, not everybody who wants to write is able to do that. Even if they're great writers, they might not have a voice that has a sort of very broad appeal to it. So I feel like I've been lucky in that I've been able to find that audience. I found that audience online. And then from there, I was able to tell, to show to publishers, hey, there's this audience of people out there who want this kind of stuff. So let me write a book about it, and they'll buy it. And then luckily that turned out to be true. And so I get to write another book. So the first book, The Food Lab, it was originally going to be a 2-volume set. And Maria, my editor at the time, she was like, we'll make it 2 volumes. And we actually even had it laid out as 2 volumes. And then publishers like, it's going to cost like $80. Maria was like, no, let's make it 1 volume because nobody will pay $80 for a first-time author. And so we did, so we cut out a bunch of stuff. And basically, the first draft of The Food Lab had a whole chapter on woks, on cooking and woks. It had like a pizza chapter. It had a bunch of stuff that ended up getting cut out when we cut it down to 1 volume. But so I had all this material that I had already written. And so, after the first book was successful, we were like, okay, let's start working on the second book. And and then I had all this kind of random stuff. It's like, what does a book that contains wok recipes and pizza recipes look like? What is that even? And so I couldn't think of like sort of an organizing principle behind the book. So I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to start writing at the part that excites me the most. And that was the wok chapter. So, the wok chapter at the time, I think it was like 100 pages or something. And so I went back and revisited it. I started adding recipes. I started actually fleshing it out. I had gotten up to 200 something pages, and I had only done the introduction and like half of the stir fry section, and so that's when I called Maria's successor, Melanie, and said, hey, why don't we just like turn this into a book about cooking in a wok? Because I could give you like 1,200 pages on this like easily. And she's like, sounds good. A lot of my writing ends up that way, where it just kind of grows, and then you have to rely on a very good editor to either tell you, hey, that many words is okay, we'll make it work, or you're going too far off the deep end, let's cut it back. And so whenever I'm writing, I put out as many ideas as I can, and then it's an editing process.
It's an intense level of creativity, and you churn out all this information, and then it sounds like you're just depending on where it's going to be. I mean, I was reading one, I think it was in Food Lab, where you're writing about, I don't know, it was braising or stewing or something, and you're like, oops, I didn't think I put a chart in here, but all of a sudden there's a chart, and you make a little joke about, like, you're talking even about your process of, like, I just have to tell you something else.
Right.
And it's back to that friend in the kitchen with, like, oh, and I want to tell you this too, sort of thing. You mentioned your audience and how your audience came with you from Serious Eats to the book. And you have brought a lot of people to cooking and to buying cookbooks that weren't buying cookbooks before. A lot of the Kenji superfans are not the people who have cookbook collections and are, avid cookbook readers. It skews male. A lot of them are men too.
Yeah. As far as like people buying the cookbooks, I don't know what the demographics there are, but I can tell you, like, with my YouTube channel, that skews like 80% male. And when I do events, it's often a good 60 to 70% male, I'd say. Which I don't know how that compares to the average cookbook audience, but I imagine it's a lot more heavily male than the average cookbook audience. I don't know that I have a great explanation for it, other than, like, I don't know. I don't want to be known as, like, the guy who writes cookbooks for dudes,
Right. And I don't mean to make you uncomfortable around it at all, because on the sort of upside is, I see it as you've opened up the door to a lot of people who maybe weren't buying books or weren't, reading the food sections of papers and things like that. So to me, it's a really exciting development that it's a way in.
Well, for me, the way I got into cooking, again, like I didn't grow up cooking. And I think a lot of people got into cooking because they grew up, like, in a culture that was where the kitchen was really important, where they grew up learning their family recipes or cooking with their parents or their grandparents. And I didn't really come at it from there, because, my mom came to the U.S. from Japan when she was a teenager. And then her parents kind of came here a few years after that. We grew up in Japanese was our first language. And so we grew up in a Japanese household. But my mom also, I think, was tried very hard to sort of assimilate and cooked a lot of American recipes from, ranging from New York Times recipes to Betty Crocker and things like that, And then my dad, who grew up in rural Pennsylvania and then, moved to big cities later, I think he was super interested, in particular, in Chinese and Mexican food. And so he cooked a lot of Chinese and Mexican food. We didn't really have, like, the family recipes, like the same thing that we didn't have, like, the Sunday roast or, whatever your family recipe might have been. And so by the time I started living by myself and cooking for myself, I didn't have any real cooking knowledge. And so I feel like learning to cook for me was a process of really relying on sort of my interest in science. And so, learning cooking was sort of relying on first principles and figuring out sort of the physics and the processes behind it, as opposed to really focusing on one particular sort of cultural cuisine.
Were there books that helped you do that? How did you learn that?
Yeah. So certainly, like Harold McGee's book, and watching, like Alton Brown's show, and, the book I remember reading. I remember we went on a family trip to Mexico, and I brought with me one book, and I was up every night until 2 a.m. reading Jacques Pepin's Complete Techniques, which, of course it is Western European techniques and French techniques, but it's like, here's how you chop an onion, here's how you make a stock. And so it's like, I was learning these things by reading about them. And I didn't even try cutting an onion until after I'd, a lot of the techniques in that book, I didn't actually go into the kitchen and even try. It was just like sort of absorbing the information. And so when I started writing, I feel like that approach that I took, I think I was sort of in the right place at the right time, because I feel like there were a lot of people in my generation who grew up maybe with two working parents, and so they didn't grow up with this sort of one parent at home as the homemaker cooking the meals. And so they might have grown up with two working parents and had a lot of takeout meals, or grew up in a city like I did, where there's a huge sort of multicultural, like New York, where there's a huge multicultural influence. And so you're not eating one specific cuisine, you're eating a bunch of things all the time. And so I think my audience ended up being people like that, who had never really learned like their family recipes, but my particular way of approaching cooking from a sort of first principles and science-based background was something that they understood because they had got that approach through their education in other fields. And so my audience, I do find there's a lot of engineer types and nerd types who think about problems in those ways and think about cooking as like a problem with a set of parameters and an end goal and an experiment that you can do to get, so I think it's an approach that I think is relatively unique that had this audience waiting for it. And so I just got lucky that, the way I wanted to write about cooking happened to connect with a lot of people.
In the walk, you've got blowtorches, infrared images, the comparison between the heat put out by a wok versus a skillet. And then you've got the whole, Scoville heat table for chilies. And like, if I were to write a book about the wok, I would think about those things and I would perhaps do the experiments and stuff, but I would hold myself back. And I don't know if it's because, I'm thinking about my audience. I'm thinking about like how many pages that are allowed in my book, but you put it in there. And I think that's because you've got this audience that wants that information. It's cool to them. Whereas my audience, I don't know, it's like, it's weird because I think about this, I think about like how you mentioned reading Harold McGee and Alton Brown, but my mind also goes to Shirley Corriger.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Yeah. But then like, we don't talk about Shirley Corriger as much as we talk about Harold McGee and Alton Brown. And so my thought is like, why are women, are we like not like into this stuff? And like, why shouldn't we just like put it all out there, man? I got a blowtorch and it's not just for creme brulee.
That is a very fair point. And honestly, I feel embarrassed that you point that out because I think it probably represents a unconscious bias on my part that I mentioned McGee and not Corrier.
No, but Corrier's book, it's interesting because she did something that Harold didn't do. She tried to put recipes in it and kind of, it was more of a hybrid situation where it was like she toned down the science and made it more look like a cookbook, so it's just an interesting bias that I think
absolutely.
Yeah.
Huh. And hers, it's like, it's a different approach. It's not as much hard science involved, right? Mm-hmm. Like I have Bakewise, which I have like, referenced many times whenever I have to develop a new baking recipe. But I didn't mean to embarrass you, Kenji. No, I was like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? Because I would reference, Harold McGee and Alton Brown more than I would Shirley Corriger. And what's up with that?
Yeah,
it's interesting.
And so these are the kinds of things that we talk about in Everything Cookbooks. It's like, no one else is going to talk about this stuff, you guys.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. And it's also, probably it's a sort of chicken and egg situation where, my audience skews male because I reference more male authors or come at it from a particularly sort of, male sensibility. But, it's not something I try to do. And it's certainly something, in fact, the opposite. I try and be as unbiased and as supportive of all people as possible. But, of course, when you mentioned, it's like, why didn't I include Shirley among those? Why wasn't she one of the first ones that popped into my head?
Well, by the same token, why shouldn't I put, Scoville heat ratings in my books too, to help people understand how hot can you go?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it is, your audience, I think, in the same way that I don't mind. But, but for me, it's also like, I try not to think about who's going to be reading my stuff. I just try and write it the way I feel I would like it. I think about explaining it to myself. Like when I was a young cook, how would I have want someone to explain this thing to me? And so I just write the way I want to write and hope that people will enjoy it. And I've been, extremely fortunate in my career that, that's led me down a relatively successful path. Because I don't think that certainly doesn't happen for everybody. Like not everyone gets that opportunity to sort of do what they want to do and be able to make a living out of it. So I'm very grateful.
There's one thing when you were talking about reading La Technique and again, but Jacques Pepin and how there's so much of that Eurocentric Western French is like there's the one way to cook things.
Right.
And back to your restaurant cooking experience, it's like the chef's way is the one way. And
even with all your authority and your science to it, you also do this thing that's very, I think, unique to your voice, where you often present all the options. And then, like, I'm thinking about your chicken doneness or your tomato and egg and scallion. Mm-hmm. Or the egg for fried rice in the wok. Here are the 3 ways. Here are the 5 ways. Here are the 6 different ways to cook a boiled egg. And you just put it all out there. And in many of the cases, you'll say which you prefer. But sometimes you just say these are the different ways to do it. And that's such an interesting choice as an author, because I remember getting some pushback at a few points where my editor was like, just tell me what to do. Right. I just want to know the one way to do it. And you're giving readers, you're giving cooks, you're empowering them, really. You're like, here's the information. You make it the way. There's not a right or wrong way.
That's what I hope. I do want people to feel like they can go and understanding technique and science. That's what gives you the technical tools you need to be able to make food your own. It's like, I think about it as a musician, right? You can have like an amazing melody in your head, but unless you have the technical skills to sing it or play it on an instrument or something, it's stuck in your head forever, and you can't really share it with other people. And and cooking is the same way, where it's like you can have this idea of what the best dumpling is for you, right? And it might not be the same as what's the best dumpling for anybody else, but you have this idea of like, this is the way my mom made her dumplings, and she never passed the recipe down to me, but now I want to recreate that thing. Unless you have the technical skills to be able to translate what's in your head onto a plate, you're never going to be able to make it a reality. And so what I hope with the writing I do is that I teach people sort of those technical skills. It's like learning scales when you're practicing piano or violin. Right? It's like you learn the scales and it's in your fingers. And now that you have those skills, you can play whatever melody you like. Whereas as opposed to just learning a single recipe, it's like you can only, it's like if I teach my daughter, this is the pattern of buttons that you push on the piano to get Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. All right, you can play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but you can't play it in a different key. You can't change it from major to minor. You can't then go and play, When the Saints Come Marching In. Like all you have is this one thing. And that's what a recipe is like. It's like you learn how to push the buttons to get these set of ingredients using these tools to this end destination. Whereas when you understand sort of the technique, you can start with whatever ingredients you want. You could be working in a completely unfamiliar kitchen, and you'll still be able to make it work and make something that you enjoy or that you want to present to other people. So that is the ultimate goal, is to sort of empower people and make people feel comfortable cooking however they want to cook. And I think that is something that sort of got lost in my first book in particular, because I think a lot of people read that first book and thought like these recipes are like so complex and so precise that if I change anything, they're not going to work. And in that book, and particularly when I was writing at Serious Eats and Cooks Illustrated, a lot of the recipes are like the best whatever.
Yeah.
And in my head, when I said something is like the best chocolate chip cookie, what I really meant was like, when I write this recipe, I'm going to be testing every single variable. I'm going to tell you what happens if you use brown sugar versus white sugar, if you separate the egg, if you use more egg whites versus egg yolks, et cetera. Like I'm going to test all these variables and show you what happens. And then I'm going to present you with a recipe that is like what I consider to be like one of the best chocolate chip cookies. But the idea really is that by showing you all these things, you can make whatever best you want to make. And I think unfortunately a lot of people took that the wrong way. And especially, I don't know, I felt like there's a certain sort of subset of people online who would sort of weaponize that, where it's like if somebody cooks something a different way, they would say, oh, that steak sucks because you didn't do this method that Kenji said is the best way.
You didn't do Kenji's way.
You didn't do Kenji's way. Yeah.
That's not what I meant.
Kenji said.
Yeah.
And that's, that idea that, best can mean different things for different people in different contexts, and that there is no singular best was what was the inspiration for the children's book I wrote. And also something that I've tried to keep in mind a lot more with my writing ever since like sort of seeing that happen after the first book. And so, so like in the walk, there's no best recipes for anything. And I try to avoid that language because I can see how it can get misinterpreted and misused in negative ways, which is never my intention.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting to hear you, because it's something we've noticed in your evolution. And so to hear that it was a conscious decision on your part makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it also goes back to that voice of authority and sort of the responsibility that comes with authority. If the people are turning to you to be the authority on how you do this, and especially in something like cooking in the kitchen, and something as intimate and involved with our family and our basic living,
right.
Happiness.
Right.
Yeah.
And people come to food with so many fears because, like Kenji pointed out, if you grew up not being shown by a parent or some other elder how to prepare food, and then now food has become like the status issue,
Mm-hmm.
and you also want to feed yourself and be healthy, and you don't want to mess up. You're looking for like the clearest path. But as we all, have recognized, a recipe is a roadmap. So, presenting people with choose your own adventure. And oftentimes when I'm writing a recipe, I'll like make a batter 3 different ways. And then in my latest book, I point out the pros and cons of each batter recipe. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, you choose the one that fits you today, but know that these are your options. And so part of me is like providing them the techniques and the understanding. But I got to tell you, the other part of me is like, that's my hedge.
Right.
Because I'm thinking, someone's going to ask me, Andrea, what if I don't have, rice flour? What can I use instead? So I'm always like trying to think of like the circumstances that people are cooking in and anticipating those questions. But like, do you think about hedging when you're writing?
I do. I mean, I do try and anticipate the situations people are going to be in. What I've actually found super useful is, my YouTube channel. Which I started it's been around for a number of years, but I really started producing sort of videos for it regularly, maybe 2.5 years ago now. And I've actually found it really useful to have that platform as sort of a complement to the books, because on my YouTube channel, I made a few basic rules for myself, was that I'm never going to cook anything just for the channel. It's always going to be something that I'm like actually cooking because I'm making lunch for my kids or I'm making dinner for my family or whatever, because I wanted people to see this is the way recipes are explained in books and in articles, but this is the way you apply that stuff in real life, and then the other rule was that if I make a mistake, it's going to stay in. So even, there was like an early video I did where I was making a pizza and I was getting it off the peel into the pizza oven, and it stuck to the peel halfway through. And when that happens, it kind of ends up completely misshapen. It gets a little hole in it, and at the end of this, you know what? The videos you're watching online of perfect pizzas coming out, nobody, not even somebody who's made pizza every day for their entire life, does it perfectly every time. You think back on early Julia Child episodes where it's she's cooking those things in real time with no cuts. And when she makes a mistake, she just goes with it. And I think that was what made her work so powerful, was that she had, of course, the knowledge to share, but I think showing that someone, even with lots of experience, makes mistakes, and how to deal with those mistakes, and how to be, how to be nice to yourself, how to be kind to yourself, and be okay with the fact that not every meal I'm going to make is going to end up looking like this 30-second Instagram video version of it that probably had 17 people working on it and 4 backups right, just in case. So, I think showing people and getting people to realize, cooking, it's something you can do every day. And it's if this meal, if you mess it up a little bit, it's probably still going to be edible. You messed up lunch, try again in 4 hours when you're making dinner. It's not the end of the world. It's going to be fine. That kind of reassurance, I think, helps people get over that hurdle.
Yeah, most definitely.
What's interesting is consistent with your, correct to say you photographed both your books.
Yeah.
Which not every author does that. Exactly. Few do. So, but that's a decision that you made. I mean, there's some that are certainly beauty shots, but there's a lot that are just very service oriented. They're lit, but they're not styled.
Yeah.
They're just process shots. So to me, that's that seems like a development that led to this YouTube, that there's an openness to say, hey, this is what it really looks like.
Yeah. I mean, initially, with the first book, that was kind of a financial decision. It's just both on the part of myself and the publisher, it's just I've got a camera. I want to do it. I'll just shoot the photographs as I go. And who cares if they're perfect or not? And then I think people responded well to that. The fact that the photos are just real. This is my actual dining room table. This is the food I actually cooked. There's nothing styled or particularly beautiful about it. It's just what the dish looks like.
And you made a choice to include process photos, and that many process photos. I mean, it would to have process photos in a 900-page book, to go back and organize that would have been untenable. So it was part of the writing process, I'm sure, to do that.
Yeah, it was.
Did you have to compromise on stuff? Because every single time that I write a book, I feel like there's some unexpected challenge that I have to compromise on. Did you have anything in the walk or the food lab that you had to just kind of go, all right?
Well, let's see. I mean, in the walk, there were definitely some sections that got cut. So there was a whole section on homemade noodles, So I had recipes for like ramen, for hand pulled noodles, for steamed like horfun, for udon, things like that. And that part we ended up cutting for length. And instead, I think I just say in the book, I end up saying like, hey, if you want to make these noodles, like here's like Sho Spaith's recipe for ramen. You can find it here. It's great. And honestly, it's like in some ways that's almost, I feel like it's almost better to do that because you can reference someone who like has put a lot more time and effort into these particular noodle recipes than you have. And your reader, for the particular reader who is really gung-ho about making their own noodles, or maybe lives in a place where they can't get their own noodles, they're actually going to get a better education on doing this by reading this other person's work on it than the condensed version you could have fit into a single book. And so, yeah, I guess I mean that would be the biggest compromise in the walk book. I mean, the food lab, I think the big compromise was organizational and trying figuring out what to cut out of everything I had. No, I feel working at Norton with Maria and now with Melanie has actually been like an overwhelmingly positive and supportive experience for me. That especially with the walk, it was like I've told Melanie like, here's what I want to do. Like I want to write this book on walk cooking, and she's just like, go for it. And so I feel like I've been actually very well supported. And even when I said, hey, I want to write a children's book, that was kind of like I was like, what are they going to say when I say I want to write a children's book? And I of course, like at that point, I sort of knew how publishing works, and I knew, all right, you have to have all your ducks in a row before you propose something, because publishing is a business, and you have to show them, here's how you're going to make money from this thing, right? So even if it's like a passion project for you, you have to sell it to them. And so at that point, it's like, all right, here's like the illustrator. Like I already had like an illustrator in mind who I wanted to work with. I had the basic story done. I had I had a lot of it sort of done to the point where I could say, here's what the completed project is going to be like, so that they could picture it and see how they were going to market it and whatnot. So there is a certain amount of work that goes into that, but they were still very supportive from the beginning, even for the children's book, which I'm very grateful for.
That's great. We don't want to take up any more of your time. You've been so generous with us, and we'll put links to your books and where listeners can find you in the show notes and everything. But before we let you go, Kenji, do you have any parting words of wisdom for, aspiring food nerds? Or
I would just say that, whether you're cooking or writing or whatever it is you want to do, like all those things that, a lot of people tell me that my writing sounds very natural. I would say that anything that seems natural to someone is probably something that they've put a lot of work into. And if anything, like writers who sound the most natural are probably the ones who've just practiced it the most. Right. And so if you want to get good at something, just do it, just do it a lot, and don't be embarrassed about not doing it perfectly at the beginning. Or finding your voice in writing, I think, is the hardest thing for any writer. It took me a long time to find my voice in food writing. Even my children's book, when I wrote that book, I wrote it a dozen different ways. Like I wrote it from the perspective of the main character. I wrote it from a third person perspective. I wrote it from the perspective of a side character, and so, yeah, practicing is how you get good at anything, even the things that seem like they should come naturally. Nobody's born knowing how to ride a bike. You do it enough times and then eventually it becomes natural.
Good advice. That's excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take good care of yourself.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. If you have a comment or a question, ping us on our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes of Everything Cookbooks at Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Please leave us a review. This helps more people find the show. Any books mentioned in the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you to our talented editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.